In this lecture, I'm going to cover landscape materials in greater detail, including the difference between the various blend types available on the Layer Blend node. Alright, so going back to the material, in order to see a preview of the output of a landscape layer blend node, you need to specify how much weight to use for each layer. That can be done using the preview weight property. The editor will use the ratio of the values set for each layer to determine the percentage of each to use for the preview blend. For example, if I set the preview weight of the gravel layer to 1 and leave the others at 0, it will use 100% of the gravel layer. And then if I now set the preview weight of the grass layer to 1, because this is equal to the value of the gravel layer, it will use 50% of the gravel and 50% of the grass. Okay, and now, to help demonstrate the next example, I'm going to set the preview weight of the gravel and grass layers back to 0, and then set the preview weight of the snow layer to 1. Alright, so next, instead of using a texture for a layer's input, you can use a property to define a constant vector3 value. For example, I'm using a vector3 node to provide a value for my snow layer. But instead of defining it this way, with a node, I can actually delete the node, and then select the layer blend node, and under the snow layer, I can use the const layer input property to set this value directly. So I'm going to enter a value of 0.81 for each float. And now my snow layer will look just like it did using the vector3 node. And then another common use of this const layer input property is to temporarily define a solid color to use for each layer so that you can more easily visualize each layer's painted weight. So I could, for example, temporarily disconnect my gravel and grass textures and then define the gravel layer to be solid red and the grass layer to be solid green. There is, however, a better way to do this now. So if you ever want a different way to visualize which layers are painted where and how strong the painted weights of each layer are, there is a landscape visualizer you can use to do this. So I'm going to go back to the level editor, and then I'm going to click on the view mode menu, and then go down to the landscape section, hover over visualizers, and then select layer debug. And note that this option is only available in landscape mode. So if you were in selection mode, for instance, this option would not appear. So now that the layer debug visualizer is active, I will have the option to assign a color to each of my layers. So I'm going to set gravel to red, grass to green, and snow to blue. And so now, the areas where I only have gravel painted on appear as pure red. The areas of only grass are pure green, and the areas of only snow are pure blue. But areas that have weight from more than one layer will blend these colors. So for example, areas with an even blend of gravel and grass will appear yellow. Areas with a lot of gravel and just a little grass will appear orange. And areas with a lot of grass and just a little gravel will appear greenish yellow. And then areas with an even blend of gravel and snow will appear purple, and so on. So this just gives you an easier way to visualize how the layers are painted on and how they are blending. And then to turn this off, I just need to go back to the visualizers menu and set it back to normal. Alright, so right now, my landscape material is only using base color data. If I wanted to use another attribute, such as the normal attribute, and I wanted it to be different for each layer, I would need another landscape layer blend node. So instead of adding a new one, I'm going to copy and paste the existing one, so that it will copy over all of the existing layer settings. And then I'm going to connect it to the normal input. So now I just need to add my normal maps to the graph. So I'm going to go back to the textures folder, and for the gravel layer, instead of using the T-ground gravel D texture like I did for the base color, I'm going to drag in the T-ground gravel N texture. And I'm going to connect that to the gravel layer of the blend node. And now I'm going to drag in the T-ground grass N texture and connect that to the grass layer. And then the starter content doesn't have any special textures for snow, so I'm just going to use the T-Rock Slate N texture for the snow's normal data. And now I'm going to connect the landscape layer coordinates node to each of the UV pins of the texture sample nodes. And now I'm going to save this and go back to the level editor, and as you can see, the landscape material now has normal data and looks much more realistic. Alright, so something you need to keep in mind when constructing your landscape material is that if all of your texture sample nodes have their sampler source property set to the default, your material will be limited to only 16 textures. I discussed this way back in the textures lecture at the beginning of the material section. Most materials won't end up needing more than 16 textures. However, with landscape materials or other materials that use layers, since each layer essentially acts as its own material, it can be very easy to go over this limit. So if you're ever painting multiple layers onto the same area, and then the entire area suddenly turns into the default gray checkerboard pattern, it's most likely because you've reached the texture limit, causing the material to fail to render. So to prevent this issue from happening, you just need to make sure that sampler source is set to shared wrap for all of your textures. The good news is that you don't have to set the value one by one. For example, I can select all of my texture sample nodes at once, and then if I change the value of a property in the details panel, it will change the value for all of the nodes at the same time. So I'm going to set sampler source to shared wrap. And now my material has the ability to support up to 128 textures. Alright, so next, I'm going to explain the difference between the 3 different blend types that are available when blending landscape layers. So if I select one of the landscape layer blend nodes and go to the details panel, there is this property for each layer called blend type. This has 3 possible values: weight blend, alpha blend, and height blend. This property is used to define how the engine uses the painted weight data of each layer to blend them together. I'm going to try to quickly explain the differences first, and then I will demonstrate the different types in greater detail. The default value, weight blend, is what I've been using so far. The key characteristic of this type is that unlike the other two, the order of the layers is irrelevant, meaning no layer is considered above or below another. So the reason this type is called weight blend is because it blends the 2 layers based solely on their painted weights and nothing else. Alpha blend uses the painted weights as well, but it also takes into account the order of the layers. The higher a layer is listed, both on the blend node and the paint mode panel, the lower it is in the ordering. So in my case, the gravel layer is the bottom or base layer. The grass layer sits on top of the gravel layer, and then the snow layer sits on top of both. And then height blend uses both the painted weights and the order of the layers, just like the alpha blend, but it can also use a grayscale height map for each layer. Giving a layer a height map will cause the lower regions of the layer to be covered by the above layers first, with stronger painted weights required to cover up the higher regions of the lower layer. So this setting can be used to achieve the most realistic looks, and can be used to, for example, have sand fill in the cracks between rocks. Alright, so now I'm going to quickly demonstrate the weight blend type again, so we can compare it to the other types. And before I do that, I'm going to change my base layer to use a cobblestone texture, because it provides a better contrast with the grass and makes it easier to see how the layers are blending together. So I'm going to select this texture sample node and change its texture to T Cobblestone Pebble D. And then I'm going to select this texture sample node and change its texture to T Cobblestone Pebble N. And now I'm going to apply the changes and go back to the level editor. So now my base layer is using this cobblestone texture. And now I'm going to turn the tool strength down and select my grass layer and paint some grass in at various weights. And now I'm going to take a screenshot of this so that we can compare it with the other blend types. And now I'm going to go back to the material, and for the base color, I'm going to change the blend type of each layer to alpha blend. And then I'm going to save the material. And now I'm going to go back to the level editor. And with the camera in the exact same position, I'm going to take another screenshot. So now I'm going to put up the two screenshots side by side so we can compare. So on the left here is the weight blend, and on the right is the alpha blend. So if you look at the weight blend, you will see that the two layers blend together in a way that doesn't indicate either layer being on top of the other. However, in the alpha blend screenshot, the grass is clearly laying on top of the cobblestone. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the material and change all of the blend types to height blend. And when I do so, an extra input will appear on the blend node for each layer. These inputs can be used to provide the layer with a height map. For now, I'm only interested in defining a height map for my cobblestone layer. So I'm going to go to the starter content and to the textures folder, and I'm going to open the T cobblestone pebble D texture in the texture editor. And then I'm going to isolate just the alpha channel. So as we learned in the materials section, the way height maps work in Unreal is that darker pixels represent lower areas and lighter pixels represent higher areas. So the alpha channel for this texture has this grayscale image of the cobblestone where the areas between the rocks are dark and the rocks themselves are a bit lighter. So I can use this as a rough height map for the cobblestone. So I'm going to go back to the material editor, and I'm going to drag a wire out of the alpha channel of the cobblestone texture and connect it to the height input for the gravel layer, which is actually the cobblestone now. And then for the grass and snow layers, the height data should be consistent across the entire texture. So instead of providing these layers with a height map, I can simply use this const height input property to define a height value that should be used for every pixel of the layer. So I'm going to set this to 0.5 for both the grass and the snow layers. And then apply the material. So now I'm going to go back to the level editor, and you can see that in the areas where the grass layer has low weight, it's only filling in the areas between the rocks. It requires greater painted weight for the grass to cover the rocks themselves, which are higher than the areas in between. So this might not make much sense with a grass texture, but you can see how this would be useful if you were blending, say, sand with the cobblestone. Alright, and that will conclude part 2 of the Landscape Paint Mode lecture.